"You don't own anything anymore." That was the last thing my grandson said before they shut the doors. Behind them, the lock clicked like a gun being cocked. I stood on the cracked pavement outside the care facility, my overnight bag still dangling from my hand, fog pressed against the windows. I could see their silhouettes laughing inside the lobby. Laughing. My name is Joe. I'm 74 years old, born and raised in San Francisco back when fog meant fishermen and not luxury condos. I ran my family's farm on the southern edge of the city for 50 years, raised 2 kids, buried 1 husband, and kept every nail and fence post upright with my own hands. I'm not fragile. I'm just quieter now. Or at least I was. The night air smelled like wet eucalyptus and diesel. The streetlights buzzed, halos bleeding through the fog. My bus had already left. The receptionist wouldn't let me back in, saying my family had filled out paperwork. "For your safety," she added with a rehearsed smile. My safety. Right. I sat down on the cold bench, my fingers stiff, and replayed everything. The forged signatures, the way they convinced the bank to give them a loan in my name, the farm deeds they slipped out of my office while pretending to help me sort through the old papers. The money, every penny I had tucked away for retirement, gone. And then there was the fire. I smelled it before I saw it, that sharp, sickening mix of gasoline and burning timber. They said it was an accident, a faulty generator, but I remember the faint tire tracks at the edge of the field, the gas cans behind the barn. They didn't even bother to hide it well. I told the officers. They patted my shoulder like I was telling bedtime stories. "It's best to rest now, ma'am. Your family's taking care of everything." Family. I leaned back against the bench. The fog was so thick it muffled the city's sounds. Somewhere, a distant ship horn groaned. I thought of the farmhouse kitchen, the creak of the floorboards at dawn, the smell of strong coffee on the wood stove, the faded wallpaper with tiny yellow flowers. It was gone now. Ash and debt. And me, locked out like some stray they'd finally managed to get rid of. But here's the thing about being 74. People think you're done, that your mind drifts like smoke and your hands can't hold a hammer anymore. They see the wrinkles, not the resolve. They hear the slower steps, not the calculations behind them. They thought locking me up would make me harmless. They were wrong. A cold gust swept down the street, pulling at my jacket. I watched a single moth circle the street lamp again and again, burning its wings on the light. It reminded me of them, drawn to the shine of easy money, not seeing the heat waiting underneath. I almost laughed. Almost. I knew where the first thread had started to unravel. It wasn't the fire. It wasn't the loan. It was 3 months earlier, on a Sunday morning. My grandson, Luke, had shown up in his slick car, his girlfriend wearing sunglasses inside the house. "We're just helping you manage things, Grandma," he'd said, sliding the papers across the kitchen table. "You can trust us." The way his hand hovered over mine before I signed, that tiny hesitation, I caught it. I didn't say anything then. I should have. But I didn't. I let love blind me. That was my mistake. Not anymore. Somewhere deep inside, a switch flipped that night outside the care facility. I wasn't just humiliated. I was awake, sharp, and I remembered everything they'd ever overlooked. The spare keys, the old filing cabinets, the neighbors who still owed me favors, the banker who'd gone to high school with my late husband. Every weakness they thought didn't matter because Grandma won't notice. I noticed. At dawn, I boarded the first bus headed toward the city, my hands wrapped tight around the rail as if I were holding on to the last solid piece of my life. The skyline emerged through the fog, glass towers, cranes, and the faint smell of ocean salt. San Francisco had changed, but I hadn't. The bus driver glanced at me in the mirror. "You okay, ma'am?" I smiled, not kindly. "Better than they think." I got off near the old waterfront. The cold wind whipped through my hair. I walked toward a payphone, yes, one of the last left standing near Pier 36, and pulled out a slip of paper I'd kept hidden inside my shoe, a number I hadn't called in 15 years. My late husband's lawyer, the man who'd helped us set up the original trust back when our kids were still honest. My fingers shook, but not from fear, from focus. The line rang. Once, twice. Then a familiar gravelly voice. "Joe? Well, I'll be. I thought you'd forgotten about me." "Not a chance," I said. "I need to make a few things disappear." The pause on the other end told me he understood exactly the kind of disappearance I meant. Not people, but power, paper, assets, signatures. And suddenly the fog didn't feel so heavy anymore. They thought they'd buried me in some quiet, padded room. They didn't realize I'd already started digging my way out. With a shovel they left right beside me. Next came the part they never saw coming. The next morning, I walked into the bank with clothes still smelling faintly of smoke. The building loomed like a glass fortress, polished floors reflecting sharp morning light. A man in a suit opened the door for me with the kind of forced politeness people reserve for someone they think doesn't understand what's going on. But I understood plenty. I approached the teller's desk, clutching the small leather notebook I'd kept hidden in my sewing box for decades. Inside were every transaction, every bill, every small note my husband and I ever wrote down when the farm still stood. That notebook was my memory, my proof. "Good morning," I said, forcing a gentle smile. "I'd like to review the loan account tied to my property on Silver Creek Road." The teller typed briskly, her nails clicking like tiny hammers. "Of course, ma'am. May I have your ID?" I handed it over. Her eyes flickered for just a second before she forced her smile again. "One moment, please." She disappeared through a side door. That flicker. I caught it. I shifted my weight, scanning the sterile lobby. The air smelled like disinfectant and brewed coffee from a nearby machine. Behind me, a man's shoes squeaked across the floor. I tapped the notebook against my leg to keep from shaking. She returned with a manager, a tall man with gray temples and a folder tucked tightly under his arm. "Mrs. Franklin," he said, "may we speak in my office?" Mrs. Franklin, I hadn't heard that name said with actual respect in months. Inside his office, the blinds were half closed, slats of light cutting across the mahogany desk. He placed the folder down with careful precision. "I understand you want to review a loan tied to your property." "Yes," I said, because I didn't take one. He didn't flinch, not even a twitch. That's when I knew. He flipped the folder open and slid a document toward me. My signature stared back from the bottom of the page, clean and perfect, except for one thing. They'd copied my old loop on the J, a loop I'd stopped using 3 years ago after my hand started cramping. It was small, but I saw it instantly. I leaned back slowly. "That's not me." "I see," he replied carefully, "but this was notarized." I scanned the notary stamp. My stomach turned. The name was familiar. A neighbor's cousin. She'd come to one of Luke's barbecues last summer, laughing with a drink in her hand while my grandkids talked about making modern changes to the farm. I remembered every word, every look. He went on about liability and signatures, but I barely heard him. My mind was somewhere else, standing in my kitchen watching my grandson's girlfriend slide that envelope across the table. I had trusted them. They had planned this for months. When I left the bank, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the city's jagged skyline against a pale blue sky. I stood on the sidewalk, letting the sun hit my face. For a moment, I almost felt the old warmth again. Then a group of tourists passed, laughing, pointing at some mural on the opposite wall. Their voices bounced around me like echoes of another world, one I no longer belonged to. I took out the folded document I'd slipped into my coat. I hadn't signed it, but they had used my name, and that meant one thing. Somewhere, there were weak links in their chain. Someone notarized that fraud. Someone processed it. Someone could talk. I headed toward the neighborhood where the notary lived. My old neighborhood. Rows of Victorian houses stacked on narrow streets, yards crowded with lemon trees and tangled vines. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and fresh bread from the corner bakery. I passed a group of kids playing hopscotch on the cracked pavement. Their laughter made something inside me tighten. I'd raised my kids here. Now I was coming back, not as a neighbor, but as a hunter. Her house was exactly as I remembered. Pale yellow with peeling paint and a wind chime made of seashells. I knocked once, twice. The door creaked open, and there she was, Carla. Her smile faltered when she saw me. "Joe, what are you doing here?" "I think you know," I said softly. Her eyes darted to the side. I was just following instructions. Luke said. I held up my hand. "I'm not here to scare you. I just want to hear it from you." She hesitated, wringing her hands, glancing toward the kitchen like someone might be listening. Then she whispered, "They said you were sick, that you couldn't handle your finances anymore. Luke came to me with papers, said you agreed. He paid me to notarize." "How much?" She flinched. $500. $500. That's all it took for her to help them steal my life. "Thank you," I said, turning to leave. She grabbed my arm. "Joe, please don't tell anyone. I have kids. I didn't know." I looked at her hand on my sleeve. She let go. "You'll hear from me soon," I said. My voice was calm. Too calm. As I walked away, the wind chimes clinked softly behind me. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That night, I spread everything on the motel bed. Documents, the old notebook, a map of the city, a legal pad filled with names. Each name had a small note beside it. Neighbors who owed me favors, city clerks whose kids I used to babysit, one banker who'd once asked me to keep quiet about his late mortgage payments. People forget how small San Francisco can be when you strip away the shiny surface. I circled 3 names, underlined one, and then, at the bottom of the page, I wrote a single sentence: "Start with the weakest link." But before I could plan my next step, the motel phone rang, a cheap, shrill sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. I picked it up. "Hello?" Silence. Then a low voice I recognized too well. "Grandma, you shouldn't be poking around. It's over." I froze. He knew. "Who is this?" I asked, though I already knew. A chuckle. "Come on, you don't belong in this game anymore. Just rest. We'll take care of everything." Click. I stared at the phone long after the line went dead. My reflection stared back from the dark window. Tired, older, but not broken. They thought I'd back down after a warning. They'd just told me exactly how scared they were. And tomorrow, I'd make my first move. The morning after that phone call, I stood in front of City Hall before the doors opened. Fog pooled in the steps' crevices like spilled milk. A line of early risers shuffled forward, contractors, lawyers, clerks clutching coffee. I blended in, gray coat buttoned to the top, scarf tucked neatly. No one gave me a second glance. Perfect. I'd spent half the night tracing the paper trail backward. If they'd taken a loan in my name, they needed property records, trust updates, tax documents, things I'd once handled myself. Buried inside a filing cabinet at the farm was a red folder. My late husband and I called it the steel spine. Inside were every deed, trust clause, and amendment. What Luke and his sister didn't know was that 20 years ago, my husband had filed a quiet title claim to protect the land from any unapproved transfers. It was buried deep, never revoked, never mentioned, and still valid. At the records office, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The clerk, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up when I handed him the property number. "One moment," he said, disappearing into the back room. I leaned on the counter, listening to the faint hum of copy machines. Every detail mattered now. The way my grandkids had overlooked old legal quirks, their arrogance in thinking paper was just paper. They'd never known how carefully my husband and I built that trust. The clerk returned with a thick file. "These are all the records we have," he said. I flipped through page after page. There it was, the quiet title order, stamped and signed, still in effect, which meant every fraudulent action that came after could be challenged publicly. And I knew exactly who would panic first when word got out. I walked 3 blocks to the office of a small local paper, not one of the glossy corporate outlets, but the kind where the editor still smells like ink and arguments. I'd babysat the editor's older sister back in the 70s. She owed me a favor. She nearly fell out of her chair when she saw me. "Joe Franklin, I thought you moved out of the city ages ago." "Not yet," I said, "and I've got a story for you." She leaned in. "How big?" "Big enough to make a few rich kids very nervous." I handed her copies of the fraudulent loan, the quiet title order, and the notary's name. Her eyes widened as she read. "This is serious." "I know," I said evenly, "but I don't want a headline, not yet. I want you to file a preliminary inquiry, official, so there's a paper trail outside of their control, quiet but real." She grinned. "Old school trap. I like it." Within 2 hours, a clerk at the newspaper filed a public records request about the fraudulent loan. It wasn't loud enough to make the front page, but it was loud enough to rattle the right cage. By the afternoon, I was sitting in a corner booth of an old diner overlooking Market Street, sipping black coffee as cable cars clanged in the distance. Through the window, the city shimmered in midday sun. My heart beat steadily. I wasn't striking with fire or fury. I was striking with paper, the kind that doesn't burn. And right on cue, my phone rang. "Grandma, what did you do?" Luke's voice cracked slightly. He was trying to sound calm, but I heard it. That faint tremor. Panic, tucked under arrogance. I stirred my coffee. "What's wrong, dear?" "There's some kind of legal thing in the paper, about the property. Why would you—" "I don't read much these days," I interrupted, feigning confusion. "Maybe someone finally realized something's off." He exhaled sharply. "Listen, we need to talk. Meet me tonight, at the old barn, alone." My stomach tightened. The barn. What was left of it anyway? Ash and splintered beams, now fenced off with caution tape. A strange place for a talk. But I agreed, calmly. Because if he wanted me there, he was expecting to control the scene. I intended to do the opposite. That evening, I arrived early. The sun was dipping behind the hills, painting the sky with bruised orange and fading lavender. I stood by the charred remains of the barn, boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing through the empty field. This place used to smell like hay and warm milk. Now it smelled like damp ashes. Headlights cut through the twilight. Luke's car rolled to a stop, engine humming low. He stepped out in his tailored jacket, sunglasses still on despite the dimming light. Behind him, his sister Emma emerged, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. So much for alone. "Why did you drag the press into this?" Luke hissed the moment he reached me. "You're making a mistake." "I think that's what you said when you forged my name," I replied. My voice was flat, cold. Emma scoffed. "You're confused. This is all a misunderstanding. We were trying to help you." "By burning the barn?" Silence. Luke stepped closer. "You don't know what you're starting. That title thing, it doesn't matter. We already have the loan. The farm's practically ours." "Practically," I repeated softly, tilting my head. "But not legally." For a split second, his confident mask cracked. Just enough for me to see the fear underneath. I turned to leave. "Enjoy the evening, kids. You'll be hearing from more than just me soon." As I walked away, their voices rose behind me, frustrated, scrambling, trying to figure out what I'd done. I didn't look back. Back at the motel, I unfolded a map and laid it across the bed. There were still gaps in their plan, holes they'd patched hastily. The fraudulent loan wasn't the only thing I could pull on. Their arrogance left breadcrumbs, forged signatures, notarized lies, fake medical reports to get me committed. And somewhere in that mess, They'd made a critical error. I just had to find it. I flipped through the loan documents again, tracing the notary stamp, the date of filing, and then it hit me. An odd line in the medical paperwork, the signature of a doctor I didn't know, a clinic I'd never visited. I circled it with my pen. My pulse quickened. If they'd faked medical clearance, they'd crossed into a different territory entirely, one that carried real consequences. The first strike had landed, quietly, legally, and they were already sweating. The next strike wouldn't be quiet at all. I should have known they wouldn't sit quietly. 2 days after the barn meeting, I woke to the sound of pounding on my motel door. 3 sharp knocks. I slipped my old housecoat over my shoulders and opened it just a crack. A man and a woman stood outside. Clean suits, clipped voices, government badges. "Mrs. Franklin?" the woman asked. I nodded. "I'm with Adult Protective Services. We've received reports of erratic behavior and possible financial mismanagement. We'd like to speak with you." For a second, everything in me went still. Reports. Erratic behavior. They were flipping the script. I stepped aside, letting them in. The motel smelled faintly of disinfectant and instant coffee. Papers covered the small table. Maps, notes, legal copies. They scanned everything like hawks circling a carcass. "We've been informed that you may be under undue stress," the man said, pulling out a clipboard. "There's concern about your ability to manage your own affairs." I laughed, short and sharp. "Concern from whom?" He didn't answer, but I didn't need him to. Luke, Emma, of course. They asked about my finances, my health, whether I had experienced any confusion recently. Each question was polite, rehearsed, dipped in syrup. But underneath, I heard the real message. They were laying groundwork to have me declared incompetent again. The woman leaned forward. "Mrs. Franklin, if you need assistance, we can help arrange temporary guardianship. Your grandchildren are—" I slammed my palm on the table, making the papers jump. "They are thieves." The air snapped. The woman blinked. The man cleared his throat. "We'll make a note of your statements," he said. "Expect a follow-up." When they left, the motel room suddenly felt smaller. The walls pressed in. I sank onto the bed, fingers gripping the edge. For the first time since this began, doubt crept in. They had money, lawyers, public sympathy. All I had were old papers, a few contacts, and my memory. And memory, people say, is unreliable at my age. Convenient. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. The hum of the neon sign outside was like a distant mosquito, constant and irritating. Could they really pull it off again? Could they make me the villain in my own story? By afternoon, my fears deepened. My lawyer contact, my late husband's friend, called with bad news. "Joe, the bank's legal team is moving fast," he said. "They filed for a motion to dismiss any title claims. They're arguing mental incompetence at the time of signing." My throat tightened. I wasn't incompetent. I know. But proving that will take time, money, and they're trying to fast-track everything. I hung up, heart pounding. They were clever. They weren't just fighting me. They were erasing me on paper, piece by piece. That evening, I walked the streets near the waterfront to clear my head. The fog rolled in low and heavy, swallowing the bridge in the distance. Streetlights glowed like floating lanterns. I watched a young couple share a pastry on a bench and felt something twist deep inside. I'd built my life with steady hands, brick by brick, harvest by harvest. And now, 2 reckless grandchildren were burning it for a loan they'd probably already wasted. I almost gave in. Almost. But then I passed by the notary's house again, Carla. Her wind chimes clinked in the night breeze. Her porch light flickered, and I remembered the way she'd whispered, "He paid me." That crack in the wall. It wasn't much, but it was something. I pulled out my notebook under the streetlight. On the page, with the circled doctor's name, I added 2 more words beneath, clinic records. If they faked my medical evaluation, they'd have to forge files too. That meant signatures, logs, maybe even surveillance footage. People don't realize how sloppy fraud becomes once arrogance sets in. The next morning, I made my way to the clinic listed on the paperwork, a sterile building tucked between two aging apartment blocks. Inside, the waiting room smelled like antiseptic and cheap air freshener. A receptionist with a heavy necklace greeted me. "I have a question about some medical records," I said, handing her a copy of the form with the doctor's signature. She frowned. "Dr. Patel? He hasn't worked here in months." A hook buried deep. I tugged. "Do you have his employment record? I need to verify something." She shook her head. "You'd have to speak to admin." I spent the next hour in the administrative office pretending to be confused, harmless, just another elderly woman lost in paperwork. They underestimated me. Again. I learned that Dr. Patel had left the clinic 6 months before the date on my medical forms. The signature on the file was a forgery. I walked out of that clinic with my heart thundering. That was the weak seam I needed. But before I could celebrate, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mrs. Franklin, this is Officer Rourke with SFPD. We've received a complaint regarding harassment and trespassing. You're being asked to refrain from approaching your grandchildren's property or any associates. Failure to comply may lead to legal consequences." I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. "They filed a restraining order?" I asked. "Preliminary," he replied. "Temporary injunction. You'll be served later today." The call ended. My hands shook, not with fear, but with a slow, simmering fury. They were tightening the net. I'd struck once, and now they were retaliating fast. Back at the motel, a stack of envelopes awaited me at the front desk. Legal notices, hearing dates, petitions, all wrapped in the cold efficiency of printed language. For a moment, looking at that stack, I felt small, like a single candle against a storm. But storms, I reminded myself, can be redirected. I stayed up all night drafting letters, copying documents, preparing the clinic evidence. My motel room looked like a war bunker of paper. At dawn, exhaustion finally hit. I slumped against the wall, surrounded by files, and that's when I noticed it. One of the envelopes wasn't from a law office. It was handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single photo, grainy black and white. It showed Luke and Emma standing in what looked like a bank office, papers in hand. Behind them, on the desk, was a document with a seal I recognized, a county clerk's seal, one that could only be accessed from inside the records office. Someone had taken that photo, someone on the inside. I flipped it over. 3 words in shaky handwriting. They made a deal. My exhaustion vanished. Someone was watching them. Someone else didn't like what Luke and Emma had done. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't fighting this war alone. 2 weeks. That's how long they managed to drag me through hearings, evaluations, and whispered questions that all led to the same pointed phrase, mental competence. Every morning I walked through the courthouse's revolving doors with my head held high, while Luke and Emma arrived in tailored outfits, whispering to their lawyer with practiced solemnity. To anyone watching, they looked like concerned grandchildren. And me? I was the stubborn old woman fighting against her own best interests. They were winning the performance. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. Their attorney, a slick man with a voice like a commercial, painted a picture of a confused elderly woman unable to handle complex financial matters. Every time he said confused, I saw Emma's slight smirk. Every time he said vulnerable, Luke pretended to look down sadly as if heartbroken by my decline. And the judge? He didn't look convinced, but he didn't look sympathetic either. Bureaucracy has a way of making truth blurry. I sat there, hands folded on the table, while they presented the forged medical documents as evidence of my declining mental health. Their lawyer waved them like proof carved in stone. I watched silently, knowing something they didn't. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man who hadn't worked at that clinic for months. But timing matters. Evidence, no matter how sharp, has to be wielded at the right moment. And my moment hadn't arrived yet. After the hearing, reporters hovered outside, sniffing for a story. Emma put on her best, concerned granddaughter face. "We just want what's best for Grandma," she said, loud enough for microphones to catch. Luke stood behind her, nodding solemnly. I kept walking. Back at the motel, the anonymous photo burned in my mind. Luke and Emma in that bank office, papers in hand, clerk's seal behind them. They made a deal, the note had said. But with whom? And why was someone watching? I pinned the photo to the wall beside my map. San Francisco isn't a big city once you start pulling at the seams. Everyone knows someone, especially in City Hall. I decided to start quietly. Late that night, I walked into a small bar tucked between warehouses, one of those places where the floors creak and everyone pretends not to listen. In the corner sat George Russo, former clerk, retired but not entirely detached. He'd processed our farm deeds decades ago, and he'd been the kind of man who always had his ear close to the ground. He squinted when he saw me. "Joe Franklin, thought you'd vanished." "Not yet," I said. "I need information." He leaned back. "About?" I slid the photo across the table. His eyebrows rose. "Well, well, that's not supposed to exist." "Who are they meeting with?" He tapped the image. "That seal? That's the deputy recorder's desk. If this was taken recently, then either someone high up signed off or they bribed someone who did." I leaned in. "Names." He gave me one, and it made my stomach turn. Glenn Whitaker, a mid-level deputy who'd always been a little too fond of side favors. He was also the same man who once begged me not to expose his foreclosure mess 20 years ago. I had helped him, quietly. I still had the letter. The next morning, I visited the records office. I wore my nicest coat, hair neatly pinned, pearls around my neck. People underestimate a woman who looks like she's just out for errands. Glenn Whitaker nearly tripped over himself when he saw me approaching his counter. "Mrs. Franklin," he said, smiling too wide. "It's been ages." "It has," I replied. "You look well." He shifted nervously. "What brings you here?" "Oh, just some old documents," I said casually. "But while I'm here, I thought I'd remind you, I still have that letter you wrote back in 2003, the one about your mortgage." His smile faltered. "You wouldn't—" I slid the anonymous photo toward him. "Tell me what they gave you, Glenn." His Adam's apple bobbed. "A cut. 10,000 to push the loan paperwork through without flagging the title discrepancy. They said it was temporary, that they'd handle Grandma later." I held his gaze. "You're going to fix that mistake." He swallowed hard. "How?" "You're going to file a corrective statement, quietly, and you're going to backdate it to the day before their loan was approved, legally, which, as you know, is within your power as deputy recorder." Glenn exhaled shakily. "Joe, if this gets out—" "Oh, it will," I said softly, "but maybe not with your name attached, if you do the right thing." He looked down. Then slowly he nodded. I walked out of that office with something more valuable than any headline: leverage. But my small victory didn't last long. That evening, a black SUV idled across the street from my motel. Its headlights were off. Engine running low. I watched it from behind the curtain. 10 minutes, 15, 20. Finally, it pulled away. The next day, someone broke into my room. Nothing was stolen, but my papers had been moved, my files sifted through. A message, clear as day: "We see you." The motel manager shrugged. "Could have been kids," he said. No, this was methodical, silent. I sat on the bed looking at the disarray, and for the first time in weeks I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with fog. They weren't just tightening legal nets anymore. They were circling in the shadows, too. I almost called the police. Then I remembered the officer who'd casually informed me about the restraining order. If Luke and Emma had gotten their claws into a clerk, what stopped them from whispering to a cop? Instead, I locked the door, packed my things, and checked out before sunrise. As the bus pulled out of the station, I watched the city lights blur through the fogged window. They thought they'd forced me into a corner. But corners have edges, and edges cut both ways. Glenn's corrective filing was already in the system. Quiet, unnoticed, for now. And as I leaned my head against the cold window, a slow, determined smile crept across my face. Because what they didn't know was that their entire scheme now stood on a foundation with a crack, and I was the one holding the chisel. 3 weeks after Glenn filed the corrective statement, the storm broke. Not slowly, all at once. It started with a call from the bank's legal department. "Mrs. Franklin," a clipped voice said, "we've been notified of a discrepancy in the property records related to the Franklin loan. We're temporarily freezing associated accounts until further review." I almost laughed. They didn't know it was me who'd planted that crack beneath their feet. By noon, Luke's number lit up my phone. I let it ring out. He called again and again. When I finally picked up, his voice was tight, brittle. "What did you do?" he hissed. "Me?" I said, feigning surprise. "I'm just an old woman, remember? Hardly capable of anything serious." "Don't play games, Grandma. They froze the funds. We can't touch a cent." "Maybe that's for the best," I replied. "Money's a lot like quicksand. The more you fight it, the faster it swallows you." Silence. Then a sharp exhale. "You're going to regret this." I hung up before he could say more. Because I knew panic makes people sloppy, and sloppy people make mistakes. That afternoon, I returned to the small newspaper office, the same editor who'd quietly filed that records request weeks earlier. She looked up from her desk, eyes gleaming. "Joe," she said, "your grandkids are in trouble, aren't they?" "Not yet," I replied, "but they will be." She handed me a thin folder. "A source sent us this anonymously. It's interesting." Inside were copies of loan withdrawal records. Luke and Emma had siphoned nearly half the loan money into a new joint venture, some flashy eco-luxury startup registered under a shell LLC. But what caught my eye wasn't the name. It was the signature at the bottom of the incorporation papers. Emma's boyfriend, a man with a past. I recognized him immediately. Tyler Knox. 3 years ago, his construction company had been sued for insurance fraud, settled quietly but not cleanly. He wasn't just a bystander. He was their partner, a new thread, one I could pull hard. I spent the next day digging through county business filings, corporate records, and public databases. My eyes burned from the screen's glow in the library's computer lab, but I didn't stop. Piece by piece, their scheme took shape. They'd planned to flip the farm into a high-end, sustainable retreat, using my name as collateral to get the loan, then transfer ownership through the LLC once I was declared incompetent. The farm wasn't the prize. The land was. I leaned back in my chair, heart hammering. For the first time, I saw the full scale of their betrayal. Not just theft, not just greed. It was deliberate erasure. They wanted to rewrite history with their names on top. I walked out into the foggy afternoon, the city bustling around me. Street vendors shouted, cable cars clanged. Somewhere, seagulls screamed over the bay. It was chaos, alive and loud, and for the first time in months I felt like I was moving in rhythm with it. I had leverage now, real leverage. But so did they. 2 days later, Emma showed up at the motel. No warning. Just a knock. When I opened the door, she stood there in a crisp white coat, sunglasses perched on her head like she owned the world. "You've had your fun," she said, stepping inside without asking. "But this is over." I stayed by the door. "Bold of you to walk into the lion's den." She gave a small laugh. "Lion? Please, you're a tired old woman clinging to paperwork. You really think anyone's going to believe you over us?" I didn't answer. She walked around the room slowly, eyes scanning the stacks of documents like she was already rehearsing how to discredit me. "You've always been dramatic," she continued. "It's pathetic, really. You could have lived out your days comfortably, but no, you had to make this a war. Well, you'll lose. We've got lawyers, banks, public sympathy. You've got... what? A few dusty files? She leaned closer. Her perfume was sharp, expensive. Sign over whatever's left, and maybe we'll let you keep a room on the property when the retreat opens. Otherwise, when this hits court again, they'll laugh you out of the building. I smiled then, slowly. You talk too much. Her face faltered for half a second. That was all I needed. By the way, I added casually, does Tyler know about Glenn's corrective filing or the frozen accounts? Or that little newspaper folder with your signatures on it? The blood drained from her face, just enough to confirm everything I suspected. You're bluffing, she whispered. Try me. She turned on her heel and stormed out. Her composure cracked, just a little, enough to tell me she wasn't as untouchable as she pretended. That night, I received a call from Glenn. Joe, he said nervously, someone came by the office asking questions, not subtle. Emma, I guessed. He hesitated. No, Tyler Knox. My grip on the receiver tightened. The outsider was getting involved, and men like Tyler didn't play nice when money started slipping through their fingers. I hung up and paced the room. Tyler wasn't bound by family ties. If he thought Luke and Emma were jeopardizing his investment, he'd turn on them fast. And if he turned, I could use that fracture. I decided to push. The next morning, a plain envelope left the motel under my name. Inside was a single photocopy, the loan withdrawal records and Glenn's corrective filing. No explanation, no signature. It was addressed to Tyler Knox. By evening, Luke called again. His voice wasn't just panic this time. It was furious. What are you doing? Tyler's threatening to pull out. You're ruining everything. Sounds like you've got problems, dear, I said sweetly. You should talk to your business partner. He seems upset. You'll regret this, he growled. I smiled into the phone. I already did, for years. I'm done regretting. I hung up, heart pounding. They were splintering. The trap wasn't closed yet, but it was tightening. Every lie they told now had a crack running through it. And then, just when I thought I'd gotten ahead, a letter arrived. Heavy paper. Official seal. The court date had been moved up. 2 weeks earlier. They were going for the kill fast. I stared at the letter, the edges trembling in my hands. They were cornered, desperate. And desperate people can be dangerous. This wasn't just legal chess anymore. It was endgame. The city courthouse loomed like a stone sentinel when I arrived for the pre-trial conference. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries slicing through the chilly morning air. A line of attorneys filed through security like clockwork, briefcases clicking against tile. I walked among them slowly, deliberately, clutching my worn leather notebook to my chest like it was a weapon. In a way, it was. Luke and Emma were already there. She wore a cream-colored suit projecting effortless control. He wore his usual expensive jacket, sunglasses perched arrogantly atop his head. Tyler Knox stood beside them now, his sharp jaw clenched, eyes scanning the lobby like a hawk looking for weakness. And then he saw me. For a split second, our eyes locked. He gave me a smile, cold, transactional. He wasn't here out of loyalty. He was here because the money was slipping through his fingers. The pre-trial session was brief but tense. Their lawyer tried to fast-track motions, leaning heavily on the mental incompetence narrative. Mine, an old colleague of my late husband's, sharp as a tack despite his age, methodically dismantled their assumptions. He introduced the corrective filing Glenn had made. Their lawyer stumbled. Just a little. Enough to make Emma's polished expression tighten. Then my attorney dropped the forged medical documents onto the table. This doctor, he said calmly, did not work at the clinic at the time of signing. We have verification from the clinic administrator. The signature is fraudulent. A quiet ripple went through the courtroom. Their lawyer's pen froze mid-note. Emma shifted in her chair. Luke's jaw clenched. Tyler leaned forward, interested. The judge looked at them evenly. I expect clarification on this issue at the full hearing. We walked out into the hallway. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw it in Luke's eyes. Not arrogance, not mockery, fear. But I knew better than to celebrate early. Fear can make people retreat or lash out. I didn't have to wait long to find out which. That night, as fog rolled over the bay like a living thing, someone slipped an envelope under my motel door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words, just a printout of my daily bus schedule, circled in red. A threat, plain and simple. I didn't flinch. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my notebook. If they wanted to rattle me, they'd have to try harder. But it did make one thing clear. I couldn't stay in that motel anymore. I packed what little I had and made a call I'd been putting off to George Russo, the retired clerk at the bar. "George," I said quietly, "I need a place for a few nights, somewhere nobody would think to look." He didn't hesitate. "I've got a basement. It's dusty, but it locks from the inside." By morning, I'd relocated. The basement smelled like old wood and motor oil, with a single bulb swinging gently overhead. I set up my documents on an old work table, maps pinned to the concrete walls. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be, not hiding, but coiling. Meanwhile, Tyler Knox was making his own moves. The newspaper editor called me midday. "Joe, you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Tyler's been calling around trying to find out who leaked the loan documents. He's threatening lawsuits." "Let him look," I replied. "He's searching in the wrong direction." Because what he didn't know was that I'd already sent another anonymous envelope, this one to a state financial regulator. Inside, the fraudulent loan paperwork, Glenn's statement, and the incorporation records linking the LLC to Luke and Emma. A quiet detonation set to go off at just the right moment. The cracks between Tyler and my grandchildren began to widen almost immediately. I saw it the next day at the courthouse steps. Emma's voice rose sharply, her manicured finger jabbing at Tyler's chest. Luke tried to intervene, but Tyler shoved his hand away. Whatever they'd planned together was unraveling in public view. I stood across the street, watching through the drifting fog like a ghost at my own funeral. Their united front was splintering. I didn't need to say a word, but betrayal runs both ways. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo. Glenn Whitaker, sitting in a cafe looking nervous. The caption, "He talks, he disappears." My blood went cold. I called him immediately. He picked up on the second ring, voice trembling. "Joe, someone's been following me. Black SUV, same as you described." "Glenn, listen to me," I said firmly. "You're not alone. Lay low. I'll handle this." "I'm not built for this," he whispered. "They're serious." I knew he was right. Tyler Knox wasn't the type to make idle threats. Luke and Emma were greedy, but Tyler was calculated. If he thought Glenn might jeopardize everything, he'd make him disappear metaphorically, or worse. I couldn't let that happen. I spent the next 48 hours in George's basement like a general planning a siege. Every paper, every timeline, every signature. The regulator envelope had landed. They'd sent a formal request to the bank and the county recorder for clarification. Tyler's operation was under quiet investigation now. He didn't know it yet. But soon, the walls would start closing from directions he couldn't see. Meanwhile, Emma tried a softer tactic. She showed up outside George's house one morning, knocking gently. She'd found me. I opened the door slowly. She stood there without her usual armor, no sunglasses, no perfect hair, just a wool coat and tired eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "You're our grandmother." I let the silence stretch until it stung. "You burned my farm. You forged my name. You locked me away. That's not family." She swallowed. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Tyler—" "Don't you dare blame him," I cut in coldly. "You signed the papers." Her lip trembled. For a second, I almost saw the little girl who used to run through the fields barefoot. But that girl was long gone. I don't want to lose everything," she whispered. "You already did," I said. "You just haven't realized it yet." She stepped back as if I'd struck her. "You're going to regret this." I shut the door in her face. Slowly. Deliberately. That night, George knocked on the basement door, holding up a folded piece of paper. "This came through the courthouse fax," he said. It was a notice from the bank's legal team. They were withdrawing their motion to support Luke and Emma's claim. Quietly. No explanation. But I knew why. The regulators were sniffing around, and no bank wants to be standing on a sinking ship. One domino, then another. I walked back to the work table and spread out the last piece of evidence. The fraudulent medical evaluation, the financial filings, Glenn's letter, Tyler's LLC documents, and the timeline of their signatures. The whole ugly structure lay before me like a house of cards ready to fall. Tomorrow was the final hearing, and I wasn't walking in as the victim anymore. I was walking in as the architect. The fog was still thick when I arrived at the courthouse. It clung to the steps, the railings, the suits of the lawyers milling about like it didn't want to let go. I paused at the bottom, hands on my cane, staring up at the gray stone facade. For months, this building had been the place where they tried to erase me. Today, it would be where I made them disappear. Luke, Emma, and Tyler arrived in a tight cluster. Luke's jaw was clenched so hard I could see the muscles working. Emma's polished veneer was cracking at the edges, dark circles beneath her eyes, a twitch in her hand as she clutched her briefcase. Tyler looked furious, but in that cold, deliberate way predators get when they realize the trap wasn't theirs. I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. The walls were already closing. The courtroom buzzed softly as everyone took their places. The judge entered. Papers shuffled. My heart thudded steadily, not from fear, but from precision. Everything I'd worked for had been leading to this exact hour. Their attorney began with confidence, reiterating the claim that I'd been mentally unfit to handle my affairs at the time of signing. He leaned on the medical evaluation, waving it like a sword. My lawyer stood calmly. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to call our first witness." The clinic administrator took the stand, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and impeccable records. She confirmed under oath that Dr. Patel had not worked at the clinic for 6 months prior to the date on my evaluation. She presented employment records, payroll, a clean, irrefutable timeline. The forged document crumbled like wet paper. The judge turned to Luke and Emma's lawyer. "Do you have an explanation for this?" he stammered. Emma's gaze dropped to the table. Luke clenched his fists. Tyler leaned back, expression unreadable. Then came Glenn. He took the stand like a man walking a tightrope, but he told the truth about the bribe, about the backdating, about the pressure. His voice shook, but it didn't break. He handed over his signed statement. It matched the anonymous photograph. The judge read it silently, his brow tightening. And then my lawyer slid the final folder across the table, the LLC incorporation documents, the loan withdrawals, and the regulator's preliminary findings. "Your Honor," he said, "not only did they forge medical evaluations and signatures, but they attempted to transfer ownership of the property through a fraudulent LLC while misrepresenting my client's capacity. The state financial regulator has opened a formal inquiry. The bank has already withdrawn its support." The courtroom went utterly still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Luke exploded first. "This is a setup," he shouted, rising from his chair. "She's manipulating everything. She's lying." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Franklin." Emma didn't shout. She just started to shake, tiny tremors in her hands. Tyler glanced sideways at her, his face twisting into something almost disgusted. He hadn't signed up for this kind of exposure. His name on fraudulent documents meant liability, not luxury. My lawyer wasn't done. "Given the fraudulent actions, we request immediate dismissal of their claim, reinstatement of my client's full property rights, and referral to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." The judge didn't even hesitate. Granted. The sound that followed was strange. It wasn't cheering or gasping. It was quieter than that. A collective exhale, like the room itself had been waiting for the hammer to drop. And it had. Luke collapsed into his chair, staring at the table as if the numbers might rearrange themselves and save him. Emma covered her face. Tyler stood slowly, buttoning his jacket, already calculating how to cut his losses. I watched him glance at them one last time, a cold, surgical look, before walking out. He didn't even turn around. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "This matter is resolved. Mrs. Franklin, your property and legal standing are fully restored. Further criminal proceedings will proceed under separate jurisdiction." I rose slowly. My knees ached. My heart didn't. Outside, reporters swarmed. Flash bulbs popped. Microphones thrust forward. Emma tried to push past them, but they surrounded her. Questions flew about the forged documents, the investigation, the business deal. Luke tried to keep up, but the panic was setting in. The story they'd crafted so carefully was unraveling in real time. I didn't answer a single question. I walked through the fog with my notebook tucked under my arm like a shield. They shouted my name. Cameras clicked. The city's morning traffic roared like distant surf. I reached the steps and paused. For a moment, I let myself breathe. It wasn't joy I felt, not satisfaction either. Something colder, something heavier. They hadn't just tried to steal money. They'd tried to steal me, my name, my mind, my home. And in taking everything back, I'd realized something bitter. You can win, and still lose pieces of yourself in the process. I turned to look back at them one last time. Luke was yelling at a reporter. Emma was crying silently. Tyler was gone. The fog swirled between us like a wall. Weeks later, I stood on what was left of the farm. The charred barn had been cleared. Wildflowers had already started sprouting through the ash, stubborn and bright. The wind carried the distant hum of the city, but here it was, quiet. I didn't rebuild right away. I didn't throw parties or give interviews. I just stood there, cane in hand, watching the land breathe again. I'd won. Legally, financially, publicly. But family, that was another story. As I turned to leave, I saw something pinned to the old fence. A letter, no stamp, no envelope, just folded once. Inside, a single line in Luke's handwriting. "You ruined everything." I folded it carefully and tucked it into my notebook, not as a threat, as a reminder. Some victories don't end with cheers. Some end in silence, with fog rolling across empty fields.